Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling chapters of American history. Today, we delve into the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains, where three sisters transformed into horror legends that history books have chosen to overlook. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Is anyone near the mountains where it all transpired? The year was 1873. The United States was still nursing the wounds of the Civil War, which had concluded just 8 years prior. The South lay in ruins, with countless families having lost everything. In the mountainous territories of West Virginia and Kentucky, the rule of law was a distant concept. Upon those peaks shrouded in perpetual fog, where summits vanished into the low clouds and valleys concealed ancient secrets, a tale emerged that still compels locals to speak in hushed tones. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried a dark reputation. Since the era of the first settlers, these densely wooded heights have been keepers of mystery, with trails that vanished without a trace and travelers who entered but never returned. Strange sounds echoed through the pine forests at night, yet all of it paled in comparison to what would unfold on a small, isolated property in Pike County, Kentucky, near the West Virginia border. The Whitlock family had lived there for generations. They were typical mountain folk, resilient people hardened by relentless labor and isolation. The father, Jonathan Whitlock, had returned from the war missing an arm and with a disposition more bitter than before. The mother, Sarah, died during childbirth while delivering the triplets in 1852, leaving behind 3 identical infant girls who would be known as Martha, Clara, and June. 21 years later, those young women would become something far beyond anyone's imagination. Growing up motherless in those mountains was difficult enough. Growing up with a drunken and violent father was a living hell. The nearest neighbors, the Carpenters, lived almost 3 miles away along a steep and dangerous path. There was no school in the area, no church, nothing but forested cliffs and the constant howl of wind through the ravines. The 3 sisters grew up like wild animals, learning to hunt, set traps, and survive. Jonathan seldom traveled down to the town of Pikeville, the county seat. When he did, he returned drunk and enraged, usually after losing money in saloon card games. The sisters learned from a very young age to hide when they heard his heavy footsteps approaching on the trail. They learned to be silent. They learned not to cry, no matter what. And they also learned something more sinister, that in those mountains, far from any authority, a person could do almost anything without facing consequences. The first indication that something was terribly amiss came in May of 1873. A traveling merchant named Elias Turner stopped by the Whitlock property to sell fabric, tools, and medicine. This was a common practice at the time, with merchants moving from farm to farm, bringing news and goods the Highlanders couldn't produce themselves. Elias had been known in the region for years. He was a kind, middle-aged man, married with 4 children, living in Prestonburg. Elias never returned home. His wife waited a week before alerting the Floyd County Sheriff. A search party was organized, but in the Appalachian Mountains, searching for someone was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a state. Trails multiplied, split, and disappeared. Deep gorges swallowed any trace, and the forest was so thick a person could be completely hidden just a few meters away. Sheriff Thomas Blackburn, a war veteran with tracking experience, followed Elias's established route. He spoke with farmers who had seen him. The last confirmation came from a couple living about 10 miles from the Whitlock property. They stated Elias had mentioned heading there next. It was his final stop before returning home. The sheriff and 3 deputies arrived at the Whitlock cabin on a rainy June afternoon. Jonathan greeted them on the porch, visibly drunk despite it being only 3 in the afternoon. He denied seeing any merchant, claiming no one had visited for weeks. The 3 daughters appeared at the door, watching in silence. The sheriff noticed something deeply unsettling about these identical young women. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring with eyes as empty and cold as stone. They all wore ragged clothes stained with mud, their long, dark hair falling unkempt over their shoulders. There was something primal about them, something that sent an involuntary shiver down the sheriff's spine. Blackburn requested to search the property. Jonathan refused, citing the lack of a search warrant. Technically, he was correct. At that time, legal protections were taken very seriously, especially in the South, which remained resentful of the post-war federal occupation. Without concrete evidence of a crime, the sheriff had no authority to force entry. He noted everything in his log and descended the mountain with his men. But that visit left a lasting mark on his mind. 3 weeks later, another disappearance occurred. This time, it was an itinerant preacher named Reverend Isaiah Morton. He traveled alone, bringing the word of God to Appalachia's isolated communities. He was a frail man in his 60s who relied on the hospitality of the faithful. The Reverend also had a known route and was last seen heading toward the higher mountains, where the Whitlock property was located. The disappearance of Reverend Morton caused greater alarm than that of Elias Turner. A preacher was a respected figure, even in the most remote areas. Churches from 3 counties mobilized. Search parties of up to 20 men scoured the trails for days. They checked ravines, explored known caves, and followed every possible lead. They found nothing. The Reverend had vanished like smoke among the pines. Sheriff Blackburn returned to the Whitlock estate, this time with 5 deputies and a county judge who had issued a search warrant based on the pattern of disappearances. Jonathan was even more hostile, shouting about persecution, his status as a war veteran deserving respect, and the sanctity of his property. But the law was the law, and Blackburn was not backing down. The search lasted for hours. The cabin was small, just 3 crudely built rooms with no basement. The barn held only rusty farming tools and some old hay bales. The men combed every corner, turned over straw, and scanned the ground for signs of disturbed earth. The 3 sisters observed everything from the porch, always together, always silent, as if they were a single entity split into 3 bodies. Their movements were perfectly synchronized. When one moved, the others followed. Their behavior was so unnerving that some deputies avoided looking directly at them. Again, they found nothing, absolutely nothing, linking the Whitlocks to the disappearances. The sheriff was forced to admit defeat and descend the mountain once more. But a visceral feeling lingered with him that something was profoundly wrong in that place. It wasn't just the oppressive atmosphere or the strange family. It was something more. A smell in the air he couldn't identify, a malevolent energy seeming to emanate from the very ground. During the summer of 1873, 3 more individuals vanished. A fur trapper named William Hayes, a young man of 19 just starting out, a rural doctor, Dr. Samuel Pritchard, who traveled between farms treating the sick and injured, and the first female victim, a woman named Rebecca Stone, who was fleeing an arranged marriage and attempting to cross the mountains to reach family in Tennessee. Each disappearance followed the same macabre pattern. The person was last seen heading toward the high mountains, with someone mentioning they had pointed toward the Whitlock property as a landmark or a place to ask for water or shelter, and then total silence. It was as if the mountain simply swallowed these people, leaving not a trace, not a clue, not a single belonging behind. Panic began to spread through the neighboring counties. Newspapers in Pikeville, Prestonburg, and even larger cities like Lexington started publishing articles about the mysterious mountain disappearances. Some dubbed the area the Valley of Death. Others spoke of vengeful spirits of soldiers killed in the war, of ancient creatures inhabiting the deep caves, of indigenous curses. The Appalachian Mountains had always been home to legends, but now those legends, seemed to be coming to life. Sheriff Blackburn was desperate. His reputation was on the line. He was an experienced lawman who had tracked deserters during the war and captured dangerous outlaws. But this was different. There were no bodies, no witnesses, no physical evidence of any crime. Just people who entered the mountains and never came out. In August of that year, Blackburn made a controversial decision. He recruited a group of trusted men and set up discreet surveillance around the Whitlock property. It wasn't strictly legal, but it wasn't explicitly illegal either. They camped at strategic points along the trails leading to the cabin, hidden among the trees, watching who came and went. It was a risky operation. If Jonathan discovered them, violence was likely. But the sheriff felt he had no other choice. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Jonathan went down to Pikeville once or twice, always returning drunk. The 3 sisters were seldom seen, only emerging to fetch water from a nearby stream or to hunt, always together, always in silence. The men observing reported that they moved through the forest with an almost supernatural grace, making practically no sound, like predators born to those mountains. Then, one September afternoon, everything changed. A lone traveler appeared on the main trail. He was a middle-aged man, well-dressed for the region, riding a bay horse. His saddlebags appeared full, and a rifle was strapped to his saddle. The lookout saw him pass and head toward the Whitlock property. They couldn't warn him without revealing their position, so they watched helplessly as the man ascended the steep path and disappeared into the trees. 2 hours later, the horse came back down the trail alone. No rider, no saddlebags, just the empty saddle and loose reins. The animal was nervous, neighing and flicking its ears back as if it had witnessed something terrifying. A lookout managed to catch the horse and brought it to the sheriff's camp. Blackburn made his decision immediately. He gathered all his men, 12 well-armed deputies in total, and ascended to the Whitlock property. This time, there would be no discussion. This time, there would be no retreat. They arrived at dusk, as the sun sank behind the distant peaks, staining the sky blood red. The cabin was silent. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating someone was home. But there was no movement, no sound, only a heavy, unnatural silence that enveloped the place like a shroud. The sheriff knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder, announcing his authority. Still nothing. He signaled for 2 deputies to force the door. It gave way easily. It had only been leaning shut. The men entered with rifles ready, prepared for anything. What they found was a disturbingly ordinary domestic scene. Jonathan was sitting at the table, a half-finished bottle of whiskey beside him. He was dead, his body already cold, his eyes glazed and staring at nothing. There were no visible marks of violence. He seemed to have simply died, sitting there, perhaps from a heart attack or a stroke. The 3 sisters were sitting on the floor of the adjoining room, which served as a bedroom. They were holding hands in a circle, gently rocking back and forth, singing a low, unrecognizable melody. They did not react when the deputies entered. They didn't look up. They just kept singing and swaying as if in a trance. Sheriff Blackburn felt his blood run cold. There was something deeply disturbing about the scene, not just Jonathan's corpse or the sisters' bizarre behavior, but the very atmosphere of the place. The air felt thick, hard to breathe. Shadows in the corners seemed to move on their own. And that smell? Now he could identify it. It was the smell of decay, subtle but unmistakable, coming from somewhere. One of the deputies, a man named Henry Walsh, who had a strong stomach and experience with violent deaths from the war, began searching for the source of the odor. It didn't take long. At the rear of the cabin, partially concealed by straw and old planks, was a trap door. It had been missed in previous searches because it was well camouflaged and covered in dirt. Walsh looked at the sheriff. Blackburn nodded. 2 men lifted the trapdoor. What was revealed in that moment would forever change the history of the region. Beneath the trapdoor was not a basement, but a natural cavity in the rock, the kind of formation common in the Appalachians, created over millions of years by water and geological shifts. Someone had found this opening and incorporated it into the cabin's structure. And inside, in the damp, cold darkness of the stone, were the belongings of at least 10 different people. Clothes neatly folded and stacked, boots of various sizes, saddlebags with provisions still inside, a Bible bearing the engraved name of Reverend Isaiah Morton, a merchant's tools, medical instruments that could only have belonged to Dr. Pritchard, a woman's dress that surely was Rebecca Stone's. Each object told a story. Each item was silent testimony of a life interrupted. But there were no bodies. That was the most horrifying detail of all. All these possessions, all this evidence of crimes, but no physical trace of the victims. The men went down with lanterns, exploring every inch of the cavity. It was roughly 5 meters wide by 8 meters long, with a ceiling high enough for a man to stand only in the center. The walls were damp limestone, the floor compacted earth. There were strange marks on the walls, symbols scratched into the stone that no one could decipher. Meanwhile, the 3 sisters continued their singing. The sheriff ordered 2 deputies to restrain them. It was only when the men laid hands on Martha, the closest one, that the singing stopped. All 3 turned their heads in perfect, unnatural synchrony and stared at the deputies with eyes that looked completely black in the lamplight. One of them, impossible to tell which, as they were absolutely identical, smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was something wild, predatory, and utterly devoid of any recognizable emotion. The deputies secured the 3 sisters with the chains they had brought. Even while restrained, they continued to move in perfect unison, breathing in the same rhythm and turning their heads simultaneously to observe every action the men took. Not one of them spoke a word. They did not question what was happening or attempt to defend themselves. There was only that heavy silence and those vacant stares that seemed to look straight through a person. The search operation continued throughout the night. Additional deputies were summoned from Pikeville, and they brought tracking dogs in the hope of locating any trace of the bodies. The animals became highly agitated near the rocky cavity, barking and growling while refusing to go down inside. One of the dogs, an experienced bloodhound used for tracking, simply lay down and began to howl, a mournful sound that echoed through the mountains and sent chills down the spines of everyone present. At dawn, as the cold, gray light of autumn began to illuminate the cursed property, an even more disturbing discovery was made. Behind the barn, in an area covered with thick vegetation, there were signs of numerous old fire pits. The ground was marked by circles of blackened stones, and scattered amidst these were fragments of bones, too small to identify with certainty, but unmistakably human bones that had been subjected to intense heat. One of the deputies vomited. Another began to pray out loud. Sheriff Blackburn, a man hardened by years of war and violence, felt his hands tremble as he recorded everything in his notebook. He had witnessed men killed in battle, seen cities burned, and encountered the worst humanity could inflict upon itself. But this was different. It touched upon something deeper and darker than ordinary violence. The 3 sisters were placed in a cart requisitioned from a neighboring farm. Even though they were physically separated, with Martha seated at the front, Clara in the middle, and June at the back, they continued to move in the same manner. When one tilted her head, the others did the same. When one blinked, the others blinked. It was as if a single consciousness was distributed across 3 bodies, The men guarding them avoided making direct eye contact. There was something about these young women that defied comprehension, something that instilled a primal fear, even in the bravest among them. The journey down the mountain took hours. The cart moved slowly along the rugged path, swaying dangerously on the steeper sections. The sisters showed no sign of discomfort. They did not ask for water, complain about the restraints, or attempt to speak to one another. They simply sat with an otherworldly stillness, as if waiting for something only they knew. By the time they reached Pikeville, it was mid-afternoon. News traveled quickly in those days, even without telephones or telegraphs in the countryside. Messengers on horseback had spread word of the events, and a crowd of roughly 200 people or more had gathered on the main street relatives of the missing, the curious, and potential vigilantes. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anger and fear. The sheriff had to position his men around the wagon to prevent the mob from surging forward. Some shouted demands for immediate justice. Others yelled for the sisters to reveal the location of the bodies. Yet the three remained in absolute silence, their faces pale and expressionless, like lifeless porcelain masks. The hatred of the crowd seemed unable to touch them, as if they existed in a separate realm, isolated from any human emotion or consequence. The Pikeville jail was a modest structure of wood and stone, with only 4 small cells. The sisters were placed in separate cells, a decision by the sheriff intended to break their strange connection. For the first time since their capture, they resisted. As the deputies began to separate them, all 3 began to scream, not with words, but with high-pitched, inhuman sounds in perfect unison, a single deafening note produced by 3 voices that made several men cover their ears. The sound lasted about 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. The sisters then entered their cells without further resistance. But now, separated, something had changed. Each one retreated to a corner of her cell and stood perfectly motionless, staring at the wall. They did not lie down or sit. They just stood there for hours on end. The guards reported it was impossible to tell if they were awake or asleep. Their eyes remained open and unblinking, their chests barely moving with breath. That night, strange events began occurring in the jail. The 2 guards on duty, experienced men named Robert Mills and James Crawford, reported hearing whispers emanating from all 3 cells, simultaneously low, rhythmic murmurs without clear words. When Mills approached to investigate, the whispers stopped instantly, and the sisters remained facing the walls, seemingly unmoved. At 2 a.m, Crawford swore he saw one of the sisters floating a few inches above her cell floor, but when he called Mills to look, she was standing normally. Both men felt an oppressive, evil presence saturating the building. At dawn, Sheriff Blackburn found his guards visibly shaken, with Mills sporting dark circles and trembling hands, and Crawford pale and sweating despite the cool air. Both requested reassignment, and Blackburn did not argue, as he too felt the heavy atmosphere in the corridor where the sisters were held. Meanwhile, the investigation at the Whitlock property continued. The county medical examiner, Dr. Albert Brennan, examined Jonathan's body on the table where he died, and found no signs of violence or obvious poisoning. It appeared he had simply died, possibly from heart failure related to chronic alcoholism. However, the doctor was intrigued by Jonathan's extraordinarily dilated pupils, as if he had witnessed something terrifying in his final moments. Analysis of the bone fragments confirmed the worst fears. They were human small pieces of skulls, ribs, and long bones from legs and arms, all exposed to extremely high temperatures. The doctor estimated that fires burning for many hours, perhaps days, would be needed to reduce human bodies to such a state, indicating a meticulous, almost ritualistic process. Even more disturbing was the discovery of a diary hidden under a loose floorboard in the sisters' room, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. The diary belonged to Sarah Whitlock, the mother who had died in childbirth 21 years earlier. The entries, written in a shaky, sometimes smeared hand, revealed disturbing details about her pregnancy. Nightmares of 3 shadowy figures visiting her and whispering in an incomprehensible yet understood language, waking with unexplained scratches on her skin, and a growing feeling that she was carrying something not entirely human. The final entries, written days before the birth, were nearly illegible. Sarah described visions of 3 identical girls who would grow up to become something terrible, begged God for forgiveness without specifying why, and mentioned an ancient cave deep in the mountain where Cherokee natives had once performed forgotten rituals. She wrote of feeling the presence of that place calling to her, pulling at the children in her womb. The last entry was a single line scrawled in large, irregular letters across the page. "They're not mine. They belong to the mountain." Sheriff Blackburn read those words on the porch of the Whitlock cabin, watching the sunset. He was not a superstitious man, but he held the diary with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the long-dead woman's words. There was something about that mountain, something predating the Whitlocks, and perhaps the settlers themselves, to which the 3 girls were somehow connected. Back in Pikeville, preparations for the trial were underway. The county prosecutor, Nathaniel Pierce, was building the case against the sisters. It was legally complex. They had abundant circumstantial evidence: the victims' belongings, the bone fragments, the clear pattern of disappearances, but no identifiable bodies, no eyewitnesses to any crime, and no confessions. The 3 sisters simply did not speak. Pierce brought in experts from Lexington, including a psychiatrist, Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant with a European education. Dr. Müller observed the sisters for 3 days and reported that they showed no normal signs of human consciousness or expected reactions to external stimuli. They displayed no fear, anger, sadness, or any recognizable emotion. When he attempted to speak to them, there was no response or even acknowledgement. It was as if they existed in an altered state of perception, disconnected from shared reality. More disturbingly, even though they were in separate cells with no visual contact, they continued to demonstrate synchronized behaviors, moving or eating at the same time in the same manner, an impossibility by known natural laws. Mueller theorized in his report, using careful scientific language, that the sisters might be suffering from a severe, previously undocumented form of folie à trois, where delusions are shared among close individuals. But he admitted this did not fully explain what he was observing. There was something beyond conventional psychiatry at work. News of the case spread beyond local counties. Newspapers from Louisville, Cincinnati, and even New York sent correspondents to cover what was being called the case of the devilish triplets of Appalachia. Sensationalist articles filled the pages, mixing facts with speculation, claiming the sisters were witches, demonically possessed, or even human hybrids from obscure experiments. The trial was scheduled for October 15, 1873. The Pike County Courthouse, a modest room seating about 50, was overwhelmed by hundreds crowding outside trying to witness the most extraordinary event in the region's history. Judge Cornelius Hammond, a 62-year-old veteran who had presided for over 20 years, had never encountered anything like it. The 3 sisters were brought in chains, wearing simple dresses provided by the sheriff's wife, as their original clothes were evidence. Even dressed civilly, something fundamentally wild remained. Their hair, though combed, was already disheveled, and their pale faces were completely expressionless. They walked in perfect synchrony despite the chains, like a single entity in 3 forms. Prosecutor Pierce presented his case with methodical efficiency, calling witness after witness. Family members of the missing identified the belongings found under the hut. Elias Turner's wife recognized her husband's patched coat. Reverend Morton's children confirmed his engraved Bible. Rebecca Stone's sister identified the dress by its unique embroidery. The coroner presented his analysis of the bone fragments, explaining technically how the bones had been deliberately burned and processed, and estimating the remains represented at least 8 different individuals. Some jurors were visibly nauseated. Dr. Muller presented his psychiatric observations, describing the sisters' abnormal behavior, apparent lack of moral conscience, and inexplicable connection even when separated. He avoided terms like evil or possession, staying within science. But his words painted a disturbing picture of 3 minds operating in completely alien ways. Throughout the testimony, the 3 sisters remained seated at the defense table, staring ahead blankly. They did not react when victims' belongings were shown, or when family members wept on the stand, as if completely disconnected or indifferent. The defense was handled by a court-appointed attorney, Thomas Aldridge, a young lawyer only 3 years out of law school. It was an impossible task. His clients were utterly uncooperative, refusing to answer questions or provide any information. He argued the evidence was circumstantial. There was no definitive proof of murder without bodies, and the trial was occurring in an atmosphere of public hysteria that precluded impartial justice. But his arguments rang hollow. Everyone in the room, including the 12-man jury, had already formed their opinion. The 3 sisters were guilty, perhaps not strictly legally, but in a deeper, more primitive sense. They represented something dark and ancient that civilized people preferred to believe no longer existed. On the 3rd day of the trial, something extraordinary happened. One of the sisters, Martha, identified by a small scar on her left hand, slowly turned her head and looked directly at the jury. It was the first time any of them had shown conscious recognition of their surroundings. Her gaze moved over each of the 12 men, lingering on each face for a few seconds. There was no threat in that look. There was no supplication in her gaze, only a cold, evaluative quality, like a predator studying potential prey. Several jurors averted their eyes, unable to sustain that contact. One of them, a sturdy farmer named Jacob Miller, who had a reputation for fearlessness, visibly paled. He would later confess that when Martha looked at him, it felt as if she could see through him, reading not just his thoughts, but something deeper within the very essence of his soul. After surveying all the jurors, Martha turned her attention to Judge Hammond. For a long moment, the 2 figures stared at each other across the courtroom. The judge, to his credit, did not look away. He was a man of faith and law who did not believe in being intimidated. But even he felt something profoundly disturbing in that gaze, an ancient, vast intelligence that should not exist behind the eyes of a 21-year-old girl raised in a secluded mountain cabin. Then Martha smiled. It was only a slight curve of her lips, but it completely transformed her face. There was no humor or joy in that smile, only a cold satisfaction reminiscent of a puzzle being solved or a plan reaching its expected conclusion. And then, for the first time since her capture, she spoke. Her voice was surprisingly soft, almost musical, yet it carried a quality that raised goosebumps. She uttered only 6 words in perfectly clear, unaccented English. "You can't kill the mountain?" That was all. After speaking, Martha turned forward and returned to her previous state of empty stillness. But those words hung in the courtroom air like toxic smoke. Onlookers began to whisper among themselves. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order, but everyone had heard the enigmatic phrase and was trying to decipher its meaning. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges 11 counts of first-degree murder, corresponding to the number of victims definitively linked to the disappearances. Judge Hammond set sentencing for the following week, in that time and region, the only punishment for multiple murders was the death penalty. The three sisters would be hanged. The news spread rapidly. Crowds poured into Pikeville from surrounding counties. Some came seeking justice, wanting to see the murderers pay for their crimes. Others were driven by morbid curiosity, eager to witness an event that would be remembered for generations. Merchants set up stalls selling food and drink, creating an almost festive atmosphere that made Sheriff Blackburn deeply uneasy. The night before the scheduled execution, even stranger events began to unfold. The sheriff had reinforced the guard, stationing 6 armed men at the jail. He did not trust the growing drunken crowd in the streets. Fearing it could turn into a violent mob, he would not allow a lynching on his watch, no matter how guilty the prisoners were. Around midnight, all 6 guards reported hearing chanting from the cells. It wasn't the sisters singing. It was multiple voices, dozens of them, echoing through the stone walls, as if from a great distance. The voices sang in an unrecognizable language, not English, Spanish, or any indigenous dialect the guards knew. It was something older, with rough, guttural sounds that seemed to hurt the ears. One guard, a young man named Peter Sullivan, swore that shadows on the walls began moving independently of the light sources, sliding around corners in distorted, impossible human shapes. Another guard, Matthew Price, reported a drastic temperature drop in the cell corridor, his breath visible in the suddenly cold air, despite the mild October night. At 3 a.m., the singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. A heavy, expectant silence, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The guards checked the cells. The 3 sisters were in their usual positions, standing in the corners and staring at the walls. But now something was different. Intricate symbols were scratched into the stone of each cell. No one had seen or heard the sisters doing this. The symbols formed geometric patterns that seemed to move when stared at directly, creating disturbing optical illusions. Sheriff Blackburn was summoned immediately. Seeing the symbols, he felt a genuine, primitive fear he hadn't experienced since the war's bloodiest days. He couldn't explain why. They were just marks on stone. But they touched a deep, ancient part of the human brain, the part that remembered fearing the dark and the unknown. He ordered the cells cleaned and the walls scraped, but the men found the symbols engraved deep into the stone, far deeper than possible with human fingernails or the sisters' handcuffs. It would have required hours of hard labor with proper tools, yet no one had heard a sound. The dawn of October 23, 1873, arrived with gray skies and low clouds. A dense, unseasonable fog enveloped Pikeville, reducing visibility to a few meters. The crowd that had gathered overnight fell silent, watching the jail through the mist, like specters awaiting a macabre spectacle. The execution was scheduled for 9 a.m. The scaffold, built behind the jail, was a simple wooden structure with 3 ropes swaying in the damp breeze. 3 ropes for 3 murderers. The executioner, brought from another county, was experienced in this grim duty. He checked each knot meticulously, tested the rope's strength, and measured the drop heights to ensure quick deaths. He was a professional who took his work seriously, no matter how macabre. At 8:30, the sisters were brought out. It was the first time many in the crowd had seen them in person. Absolute silence fell as the 3 young women appeared. Even chained and condemned, there was something about them that commanded attention. Not conventional beauty, but a deeper, more disturbing presence that seemed larger than their physical bodies. They walked to the scaffold without resistance, showing no tears, pleas for mercy, fear, or regret. They climbed the steps in perfect synchrony, moving as if one person reflected in 3 mirrors. The priest, attempting to perform last rites, tried to offer spiritual comfort or a chance for confession, but they ignored him completely. as if he didn't exist in their perception. The three were positioned under the ropes, the knots adjusted around their necks. Black hoods were customarily used, but when the executioner's assistant tried to cover Martha's face, she turned her head and looked directly at him. The man dropped the hood from trembling hands and retreated, muttering prayers. The executioner decided to proceed without the hoods, allowing everyone to see the murderers' faces until the end. Judge Hammond read the sentence aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the dense fog. He declared that Martha, Clara, and June Whitlock had been tried and convicted of heinous crimes against humanity, and that their lives would be forfeit as payment for those they had taken. He asked if they had any last words. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then all three opened their mouths simultaneously and spoke in perfect unison. "The mountain remembers. The mountain awaits. The mountain always returns." The words were spoken 3 times by the 3 voices, creating a strange, unnatural harmony. Then silence. The executioner looked at the judge. Hammond nodded. It was time. The executioner pulled the lever, releasing the trapdoors under the convicts' feet. The 3 bodies fell simultaneously, the ropes stretching with dry, terrible sounds. Normally, a correctly calculated drop results in instant death from a broken neck, but something went wrong. The 3 sisters did not die immediately. They hung, their bodies writhing in sync for what seemed an eternity, but was likely less than a minute. When one leg kicked, the other 2 mirrored the movement. When one arm contracted, the others did the same. Some spectators turned away, unable to watch. Others prayed aloud. The doctor present to confirm death watched with horrified fascination. Finally, the movement ceased. The 3 bodies hung motionless, swaying gently. The doctor waited the regulation 5 minutes before checking for pulses. He climbed onto stools, touched each neck. There was no heartbeat. The 3 Whitlock sisters were dead. But then something happened that would turn that day into a legend, whispered for generations. The moment the doctor pronounced them dead, the surrounding mist began moving strangely, coiling into circular patterns around the scaffold. The temperature dropped dramatically. People in the crowd saw their breath condense in the sudden cold. Then came a sound, a distant rumble from the mountains, like thunder, but deeper and more prolonged, vibrating through the ground. Some thought it was an earthquake, though rare in the Appalachians, but it didn't feel natural. It seemed intentional, as if the earth itself was reacting. Birds exploded from trees in chaotic flocks, screaming. Dogs across town howled in unison. Horses tied to posts pulled free, galloping blindly through the streets. The crowd dispersed rapidly, people fleeing to their homes or nearby buildings, seeking shelter from something nameless but universally felt. Sheriff Blackburn remained, along with Judge Hammond and a few others, who forced themselves to keep composure. They watched as the bodies were lowered and placed in 3 simple pine coffins. The gravediggers, 2 brothers, named Samuel and Daniel Foster, loaded the coffins onto a wagon. The plan was to bury them in the city cemetery's section for criminals, away from respectable citizens. But when the cart started toward the cemetery, the horses refused to move. They were trained animals, but they planted their hooves and wouldn't budge. The gravediggers tried encouragement, then different horses, but no animal would approach the cart with the 3 coffins. Finally, it had to be moved manually. 10 men took turns pushing and pulling the cart along the dirt road to the cemetery. Hard, time-consuming work. The sky darkened further, black clouds gathering ominously. Lightning flashed on the horizon without thunder, giving the afternoon an apocalyptic quality, as if heaven itself was witnessing and condemning the events. In the cemetery, 3 graves had been dug in the unconsecrated section. But when the gravediggers tried to lower the first coffin, the rope broke, the coffin falling into the grave with a hollow, disturbing sound. They used new, thicker ropes, but the same happened with the second and third coffins, as if the ropes themselves refused the task. Eventually, the coffins were positioned at the bottom of the graves using planks and brute force. The priest refused to perform any ceremony, stating the women had been servants of evil and deserved no sacred words. Some argued, but most silently agreed. The gravediggers began shoveling dirt over the coffins. Then the storm finally broke. It wasn't a normal autumn storm, but a sudden, violent deluge rain so heavy it blinded. Winds that bent trees and tore roof tiles, lightning striking the ground repeatedly with deafening thunder. The storm lasted only 20 minutes, but caused more damage than any the oldest residents could recall. When it stopped as abruptly as it began, the men in the cemetery were soaked and mud-covered. The 3 graves were filled with muddy water. They had to wait hours for it to drain before finishing the burial. By the time they completed the task, it was nearly night. No one wanted to be in the cemetery after dark. They finished hastily, piling earth over the graves without ceremony or care. No tombstones were erected. The mounds were left unmarked, soon to be overgrown with vegetation, as if the town hoped to erase the memory of the women and the horrors they had committed. But memory is not so easily erased. In the days and weeks following the execution, it became clear something was not over. It started with dreams. Dozens in Pikeville reported identical nightmares. 3 figures standing in the mountains, calling, always calling. Strange symbols scratched in stone, glowing with cold light. Voices singing in long-dead languages. Sheriff Blackburn was among the afflicted, waking every night at 3 a.m., the exact time the chanting had stopped in the jail that final night. He woke with a racing heart and the absolute certainty that someone was watching him in his room, though he never saw anything. His wife noticed he began avoiding looking toward the northern mountains, the same range where the Whitlock property once stood. Judge Hammond developed an uncontrollable hand tremor. He tried to conceal it, but it was constant and persistent. Alone in his office at night, he sometimes heard whispers from the dark corners, words he could never understand. But the tone was unmistakable. It was mockery, a promise of something terrible yet to come. The jurors began having strange experiences. Jacob Miller, the farmer who had paled under Martha's gaze during the trial, found all his livestock dead one morning. 30 cattle, a dozen pigs, and chickens, all killed overnight without marks of violence or disease, as if something had simply drained their life. Another juror lost his home in an unexplained fire. Another had his entire crop wither and die overnight, the plants darkening as if poisoned. Then the disappearances started again, less frequent than during the sisters' reign of terror, but often enough to keep everyone on edge. A child playing near the forest vanished, never to be found. An experienced hunter who knew the mountains intimately disappeared without a trace. A peddler passing through Pikeville was last seen taking the road north into the mountains. 6 months after the execution, in the spring of 1874, an expedition was organized to investigate the old Whitlock estate. The sheriff had received reports from distant residents, claiming to see strange lights in that area at night, not ordinary bonfires, but lights that moved purposefully between trees, flashed in regular patterns, and sometimes formed impossible geometric shapes. Blackburn assembled a group of 15 armed, experienced men. They took supplies for several days, camping equipment, and powerful lamps. The climb up the familiar trail was harder than before. Vegetation had grown aggressively over the winter, as if the forest was reclaiming the place, erasing human evidence. Branches blocked formerly clear paths, and roots broke through the beaten earth, creating dangerous obstacles. It took 2 days to reach the property. When they finally emerged from the dense forest and saw the hut, they all stopped involuntarily. The place had changed. The hut was still standing, but deteriorating at an impossible rate. The wood was rotten and moss-covered, as if decades had passed in just 6 months. The roof had partially collapsed, the windows were all broken, and the place had the quality of an ancient ruin. More disturbing was the feeling of the place, a heavy oppression in the air, a sense of being watched by invisible eyes, a primitive certainty they were unwelcome. Their horses grew restless, neighing and trying to retreat. They had to be tied tightly to trees far from the cabin. The sheriff and his men approached the ruined structure cautiously. The front door hung open on one hinge. The interior was dark and cold, despite the spring sun outside. They entered with lit lanterns. The furniture was rotted, covered in fungus and mold. The floor was damp and unstable. But it was the symbols that captured their attention. The interior walls were covered with the same symbols found in the jail cells, but here they were larger and more complex, covering every inch of surface in intricate patterns that made the eyes ache. Some men swore the symbols moved when not looked at directly, rearranging themselves. One deputy, a young man named William Carter, who hadn't been involved in the original case, laughed nervously and called it gibberish. He reached out and touched one symbol. The moment his fingers made contact, he screamed and pulled his hand back, revealing a red, painful burn on his palm, though the wood was cold. Carter wrapped his hand and remained pale and quiet for the rest of the expedition. They descended into the cavity under the hut. The trapdoor was open, as they had left it months before. The makeshift wooden staircase was rotten, but usable. 3 men, including the sheriff, went down. The space was as they remembered, except for one thing. In the center of the dirt floor was now a hole, about a foot in diameter, but seemingly bottomless. When they threw a stone in, they heard no impact. From deep within came a faint, steady hum, as if something large vibrated in the earth's bowels, occasionally mixed with voices, singing the same strange melody the guards had heard in jail the night before the execution. The sheriff ordered an immediate retreat. The sound tapped into primal fears, telling an ancient part of the brain to run and never return. They tried to seal the hole with large stones, but no matter how many they threw in, it remained empty, swallowing everything. Eventually, they gave up, covering the trapdoor with heavy planks and stones. They knew it was futile, but they needed to act. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. They had executed the sisters, but it didn't feel like a victory, just the end of a chapter in something much larger and older. They decided to burn the hut to ensure no one else would be attracted to the place or contact the symbols. They piled dry wood around the structure, poured kerosene, and set it ablaze. The flames rose high, but when they reached the symbol-covered walls, something strange happened. The fire took on impossible colors. Deep greens, purples, and intense blues that looked cold. The smoke produced sounds, voices shouting or singing in incomprehensible languages. The men retreated, watching from a distance as the hut burned with unnatural intensity until only ashes and blackened foundation stones remained. The sheriff noticed the ashes were not normal. They were black, but didn't dirty when touched, were instantly cold, and had settled into the same symbol patterns. That night, they camped far from the Whitlock property. No one slept well. All heard sounds from the surrounding forest, footsteps of no known animal, branches breaking as if large things moved, and always that distant chorus from deep in the mountain. 3 voices in perfect harmony singing a melody that seemed to predate humanity. At dawn, they left quickly, driven by a collective desire to escape. When they saw Pikeville in the distance, everyone felt palpable relief. But they also knew nothing had been resolved. The sisters were dead and buried, the hut destroyed. But the mountain remained, and the mountain remembered. In the years after the 1874 expedition, the Whitlock sisters' story became dark Appalachian folklore, whispered as a warning. Locals learned to avoid certain mountain areas, especially near the former Whitlock estate. Experienced hunters took long detours. Families in remote regions moved to populated areas, abandoning ancestral homes. Sheriff Blackburn was never the same. He served 3 more years, but something fundamental had changed. His hair turned completely white before age 50, and he developed a visible tremor at any mention of the mountains. In 1877, he resigned without explanation and moved his family to Louisville, where the mountains were a distant horizon line. He never spoke publicly about what he saw, but those close to him said he woke screaming at night, always at the same time, with terror in his eyes. Judge Hammond remained in Pikeville, but refused cases from the remote mountain regions. His hand tremor worsened. In 1880, he suffered a nervous breakdown and spent his final years in a Lexington mental institution, drawing the same symbols repeatedly on any surface. Attendants burned his drawings daily, but he always redrew them. When he died in 1883, his last words were Martha's from court. The mountain remembers. The original jurors shared a disturbing fate. 9 of the 12 died under strange circumstances before age 60. Jacob Miller, the farmer who lost his animals, disappeared during a storm in 1879. His body was never found. Another juror was found dead in bed, with no marks, simply dead with wide eyes staring at the ceiling. A third gradually went mad, claiming he saw 3 identical women watching him from the edge of his vision. The 3 jurors who survived to old age all left Pike County, 1 to Pennsylvania, 1 to Ohio, 1 to California, and refused to discuss the trial, visibly agitated, as if remembering could summon something better left buried. The cemetery where the sisters were buried also saw unexplained events. Gravediggers reported the earth over the 3 graves never settled, always forming irregular mounds. Vegetation refused to grow there, leaving patches of dark, barren soil. Visitors, especially at dusk, reported hearing whispers from the graves or seeing shadows moving between tombstones on moonless nights. There were accounts of 3 identical female figures watching from the cemetery's edge, always disappearing when approached. Many dismissed these as superstition, but the accounts were too consistent. In 1886, 13 years after the execution, a strong earthquake struck the region, causing moderate damage in Pikeville, but collapsing the Whitlock sisters' graves into the ground as if a void was beneath them. Investigation revealed the coffins had disappeared. No tunnel, no evidence of excavation, no remains. It was as if the bodies had never been buried. The incident was recorded as seismic damage. No search or investigation was conducted. The graves were simply filled back in and left unmarked. But disappearances in the mountains continued, less frequent than in the sisters' day, but regular enough to keep fear alive. Every few years, someone would vanish in the same general region, leaving no trace. Authorities recorded these as lost in rough terrain or wildlife attacks, easier than confronting the suspected truth. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Whitlock sisters' story faded from official records. Documents were lost or destroyed in convenient fires. Old newspapers rotted. Direct witnesses died. It seemed a collective effort to erase the history from Pike County's official memory. But oral memory persisted among mountain families, passed down in cautious whispers around campfires or on stormy nights. By the early 20th century, with modernization railroads, improved roads, electricity, phones, many hoped old superstitions would die. But the mountains remained unchanged, and disappearances continued. In the 1920s, a young University of Kentucky historian named Theodore Ashford, fascinated by mountain legends, investigated the Whitlock sisters. He spent months in archives, finding fragments, incomplete trial records, yellowed newspapers, a preserved coroner's report. He located 3 people alive as children during the execution. Their testimonies were consistently disturbing. All remembered the unnatural fog, the sound from the mountains as the ropes tightened, the feeling something much older was present. One witness, 78-year-old Elizabeth Porter, told Ashford, "They were not evil young men. They were just the servants. The real evil is still up there in those mountains, waiting, always waiting." Ashford decided to visit the old Whitlock estate in the summer of 1927, against all advice. He went alone with camping gear, a camera, and notebooks. It took 3 days to locate the site. Trails had vanished, reclaimed by forest. He used old maps and descriptions. When he found the spot, he recognized it only by the blackened foundation stones. Vegetation had claimed everything. Trees grew through the foundation, vines covered stones. But the air held an indefinable, deeply uncomfortable quality. Ashford took photographs, measurements, and notes. As he searched for the cavity entrance, sunset approached. He had planned to camp overnight. But as darkness fell and forest sounds changed, primal terror screamed at him to leave. He hastily gathered his equipment and descended, but darkness caught him. He set up camp in a small clearing, lit a fire, and waited for dawn. The longest night of his life. He heard deliberate, intelligent movements beyond the firelight, and voices, 3 singing in harmony from deep in the mountain, the same melody from old accounts. Ashford didn't sleep. He sat against a tree, feeding the fire, praying for dawn. When it came, he descended rapidly. His developed photographs showed only vegetation and stones, but in several, there were strange shadows without light sources, blurred shapes that might be filmed effects or something more. Ashford never published his research. His materials were found after his death in 1952, stored in an attic box with a note. Some stories are not to be told. Some truth should not be known. Let the mountains keep their secrets. His family donated the materials to university archives, where they remain, rarely consulted. But the story doesn't end. Even today, over 150 years later, residents of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia still know the tale, avoid certain areas, and whisper warnings to tourists. Rangers report occasional disappearances, hikers off marked trails, experienced hunters lost. There are always reports, people seeing 3 identical old-fashioned women watching from afar, always immobile, always vanishing when blinked at, campers hearing strange night songs in unrecognizable languages, photographs showing 3 figures in the background no one saw when taken. Skeptics dismiss it as folklore, superstition, stories to scare tourists. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps the Whitlock sisters were just 3 deranged women who committed crimes and paid the price. Perhaps everything after is coincidence and imagination. But those living in Appalachia's shadow know better. They know places where the line between natural and supernatural is thin, where ancient things dwell, prior to civilization, perhaps prior to humanity, where the earth holds memories and secrets not to be disturbed. They know Martha, Clara, and June Whitlock, if those were their real names, were temporary manifestations of something much older and more patient. The mountain remembers, the mountain awaits, the mountain always returns. Those words echo through decades, as true today as on that dark October morning. On moonless nights, when cold wind blows through canyons and pine trees whisper ancient secrets, some still hear that distant song from the earth's depths. 3 voices in perfect harmony, singing a melody that existed before words and will exist after the last word is forgotten. The Whitlock sisters were too terrible for history books, so terrible their story was erased, buried, intentionally forgotten. But forgetting isn't disappearing. And there are things in this world, in the shadows of ancient mountains, that cannot be killed by ropes, burned by fire, or quenched by time. There are things that just wait, and wait, and wait. If you've made it this far on this journey through one of America's most disturbing and forgotten cases, I hope you found something that makes you think about the mysteries still existing in this world. If this story touched you, leave a comment below telling us what you think. Subscribe to the channel for more dark and forgotten stories like this. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the disturbing cases we bring every week. And if you know someone who appreciates true historical mysteries, share this video. The more people who know these stories, the less likely they are to be completely forgotten. Until the next journey into the shadows.